so yeah, Paris, revolution. My friend Gene. So Gene Geisler he's probably 89 now, and he was a professor of political science in California at the San Francisco State University. He was actually the first person to teach a course in the entire California State University system with the word computer in it. Though he was a social scientist. And he ended up being the head of information technology for the California State University system in the 60s and 70s, and maybe the 80s a little bit too. And he talks about, I remember we went to a little art gallery opening that a friend of mine had put together a couple months ago. And there was an exhibit focused on something called the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is a set of protests, right, in the U.S. that have been happening. And there's an image of this group of people kind of gathered around. They're looking up. You can tell they're looking at a speaker of some sort. And some people are doing other things and looking away. And some people are really excited. And there's one guy who is sort of clenched face, and he's like this. You know, that he's feeling it, and yeah, we're going to go do something. And Gene is looking at this photo, and he goes, that man he's about to get swept into the stream. You can see him. He's getting pulled by the crowd and the emotion, and you don't know what's going to come next, but you got a feeling it's probably not good. You know? And you got a feeling it's probably not good. You know? And he
kind of being too emotional, being too.
Well, yeah. His point was, this is how you get people to do horrible things or grand things or whatever, but they're no longer steering themselves. You manage to pull somebody in enough to where you can puppet them, and they march off to their death, or they go commit an atrocity, or whatever. But there's a his focus was on. He had spent a ton of time focused on how you get people to comply, like how large organizations get people to go along. And he basically at one point said to me early on when we were getting to know each other, he said, you can incentivize them, you can threaten them, you can rationalize them with them, you can get them to believe. And only one of those is worth a damn. When the military figured this out a long time ago, when bullets are flying, a bonus doesn't matter much, I'll put you in jail. Yeah, well, that doesn't matter so much right now either. No.
Can you run through those options again?
You can incentivize them. I'll give you a bonus. Yeah. Right? You can threaten them. If you don't do it, I'll put you in jail. You can rationalize with them. Hey, if we all do, if you jump over this hill when I say go, it's going to work out better for all of us, right? We're much more likely to survive. Look, I've done the math on a piece of paper. So when push comes to shove and there's a real threat, the only thing that matters is belief, essentially, or that person has come to perceive that when you say go, that's a valid order, and I will go. That you're no longer thinking, and it has to do, at one level, it really has to do with a shift in identity. A shift in identity to conceiving of yourself as part of the we in a significant way. And so it's why the U.S. military and other militaries don't spend so much time. They spend a bunch of time on nation and all of that to get people in, but that's not how they actually get people to do the work.
Sorry.
They really spend most of their time breaking people down, and getting them to form very strong trust relationships with a handful of people around them, the soldiers in their unit, and the soldiers fight for their comrades in the unit. They're not fighting for nation. They're not fighting. They're fighting for the handful of folks around them. Yeah.
It's amazing though how much money they're ready to put into keeping things like aloof.
Oh yeah,
It costs them a fortune.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah.
I'm not accused that
Oh yeah.
often, yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was wondering in winter if it was then. Because I was in September. I was in Paris just for one day because I was going from Basel.
That was all you needed.
To Brussels. I was going to Basel to Brussels, and I had booked actually through here. And then I found that it took 8 hours less if you went the other way through Paris. So all of a sudden I had a whole day in Paris. And I thought, I'll see if I can get to the Louvre. But I didn't get to it.
You haven't been yet?
I have been years ago.
Okay.
But the new one, with the big
pyramids.
Pyramid, yeah. I haven't been there.
Yeah.
So that's why I want to go and sort of, see what's different.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I mean, I have no idea what their business is. They sell a lot of tickets. The one thing I noticed in Paris that was shocking to me, coming from America, is at major tourist attractions, the food is not expensive. It's not particularly good necessarily, but it's fairly reasonably priced. In America, if you had a tourist attraction like that, a coffee would be $8, and a ham sandwich would be $15. And for the most part, that wasn't what I found.
Captive audience.
Yeah.
It may be, maybe they're wrong, or it may be, what we were discussing, last night. It may be that in Paris it would be seen as taboo to be quite so exploitative, and so that people would not.
They are quick to protest. Americans are pretty slow to protest. We don't consider it a fun way to spend an afternoon. I had dated a French woman years ago.
So we'd rather have fun with 4 years of a weird president.
That's right.
It's more fun.
Yeah.
At least for the rest of the world. No, it's not.
No.
Anyway.
I remember I dated a French woman years ago, and one afternoon she said, "Hey, I know what we could do today." And I said, "Yeah, what?" She said, "There's a bus driver protest." And I said, "Okay." She said, "We could go to that." And I was like, "What do you mean?" We'll bring a picnic basket, we'll join in.
A picnic basket?
Yeah. I was like, I don't understand this. It made very visible the difference between how the...
So did you finally go there?
In Paris?
To the bus demonstration?
No, we did not.
You didn't feel the same level.
I was like, what are you talking about? Oh, that's not how we should spend our afternoon.
It seems she just wanted to go there for the fun of it and not even being interested in the topic.
Well, I mean, for her, it was like, well, solidarity. We'll go alongside them. We'll help them gain more political power. And I was like, what? Huh?
No. Good thing.
I've been at quite a lot of protests, especially from 2012 to 2016. I think one of the most memorable ones was protesting the visit to Downing Street of the Egyptian dictator Abdel al-Sisi. Some people are calling him the president, but the actual president of Egypt is actually Mohamed Morsi, who's in jail right now, along with thousands and thousands of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I was there with mainly Egyptian members of the Muslim Brotherhood, so it was quite funny. It was quite fun. Along with some speakers. But it was a weekday evening protest, so it wasn't likely to attract many,
crowd.
many people outside of London. If it had been on a Saturday, there would have probably been more people.
Yeah. It was very, very peculiar, as you say, the way you were pulled with a crowd. We lived in Pittsburgh for a while, and in a suburb of Pittsburgh, there was a really good music hall, with really good acoustics in it. And so we'd often just go past on the way home on a Friday evening, sort of see what's happening in the weekend here there, and we just sort of jump in on it, because you could almost be sure it was either good classical music or good jazz.
Yeah.
And both we liked, yeah. And this particular one, it was Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
Wonderful classical music.
Either or. Okay, fair enough.
And so we saw it on the placard and the poster on Friday evening, and then we decided, when does it start? Right after lunch. So we went after lunch. And we didn't really read exactly what it was, and it was a demonstration. It was a demonstration, and we were the only ones. Margaret, I, and our daughter, who was about that size at that time, and we felt a real energy that was, what the hell are you doing here? Sort of thing.
Okay.
Until they heard us speaking German.
Until they what?
Heard us speaking German. We were speaking another language. We weren't speaking English. And then all of a sudden, there was a sort of, we'll take care of you.
Yeah.
I was please.
Stranger, foreigner, vulnerable.
Okay, we most likely had a little bit different clothes on. I don't know. I mean, you can't help it when you're only there for a couple of years, I think. Yeah, but it was an amazing shift of a whole atmosphere. And the thing, I pick up atmospheres very much.
Yeah.
Because apart from being other things, I'm a spiritual healer as well, and it's mostly through the atmosphere between me and the person that I get at the point of finding how they can help themselves, sort of thing. And so I'm always picking up, non-verbal communications.
Yeah.
And this was amazing altogether. And of course, Antje, our daughter, asking questions all the time in German. Oh, why are they doing this? And what's that? And they had a takeoff on stage where all these blacks had painted themselves white to show to have the contrast,
Yeah.
And she couldn't quite understand what the hell is going on.
Declan has known quite a few of the founders of cybernetics and systems theory. And
In point of fact, I don't know if you know the real story behind the internet. The real story about the internet is that it was a whole lot of different small networks, like GreenNet in Britain and Pegasus in Australia and APC in the United States. And there was 5 or 6 men, all living in community, who got together, one from Scotland, one from half Swedish, half US, another English guy who's now living in San Francisco, and they got together and they said, we're going to get this going before the military take it over, because if we get in first, and so it was a bit like George Soros getting in and pulling the pound down, you know, at that one particular day, and therefore you change the whole world, so to speak.
Sure, yeah.
Well, that was the way, and because they didn't have a whole lot of advertising or they didn't have
The propaganda
the
machine.
propaganda machine, so nobody really knows. But one of them is now running a retreat centre in the archipelago just off Göteborg in Sweden. This other guy, Mitra, he joined the Osho people later, and he lived for a while in Byron Bay in Australia, and now he's in Australia.
What's Mitra's last name?
Adon.
I know Mitra.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's splitting his time between San Francisco and Byron Bay. Yeah.
I just missed him when I was in Byron Bay a month ago.
I had a meeting with him 2 months ago.
Ah.
Yeah, he's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's a completely all-round man. I mean, when you really go into it, and also the house that he built in Byron Bay is just amazingly from the point of view of climate. I mean, it's in Byron Bay, and it's so warm that you feel like being naked all the time. So, well, he has it all fixed up that the wind is going through it at different times of the day, and it's just amazing.
Well, he has sold his solar company, which is what he was spending much of the last 10 years or so, at least.
Especially on the meters, wasn't it?
Yeah, peer-to-peer energy grid stuff.
Yeah.
Well, he had done solar, and then he went to peer-to-peer energy. These little micro smart meters.
Exactly.
Sold that, and he's come back into the world of the internet. And he's been working with the Internet Archive recently, trying to help bring them into the distributed computing world. And a lot of what he's focused on is bringing this project called Interplanetary File System into the Internet Archive. And so we had a really fun conversation and sort of a disagreement that we haven't yet resolved around universal names. You know, he worked on the HTTP specification and the URL, Universal Resource Locator specification, and and he wants global names. He wants the ability for people to go, hey, I'm reaching out for this, and I get that back, right? And my point was that actual ecosystems don't end up having global identifiers, that different organisms are sensitive to different signals. They can pay attention to different signals. And because they can only pay attention to particular signals, certain things get missed. So right now I'm paying attention to sound and light and some other things. Electrical waves, radio waves, not so much. You know, not that my body isn't capable of sensing those, but its sensitivity is so low and the fluctuations are so minute that I don't experience them in any meaningful way. And so I'm not able to steer on the basis of those. And that's actually an advantage, that ecosystems having different organisms that are only partially sensing what's happening in their environment and are actually delegating much of their sense-making to other organisms that have different capacities is something that makes for a much more resilient ecosystem. And that's true whether you're looking at organisms or social organisms, which are using information tools for fostering communication and collaboration. So we haven't come to an agreement yet, but love him. He's wonderful. I'll convince him yet, or he'll convince me yet. Yeah.
Who are you meeting in Stockholm?
Nora Bateson, Gregory Bateson's daughter.
Wow. Did you know Gregory Bates?
Yeah.
When you mentioned the
There was
cybernetics
another
thing,
daughter.
that was the name.
What was the other daughter's name?
Mary Catherine.
Mary Catherine. I knew her and actually danced with her in Greece.
I danced with her. That's even better.
Yeah.
We danced.
Well, the other person that I danced with, which is she's still alive, is the 90-year-old dancer, oh, what's her name, who lives down towards Bensur. Oh, Lawrence is her husband's name. It's on the tip of my tongue, but anyway, she's 93 and she's still giving courses. And she did this thing called the Death of Dance, and I was in Greece with Doxiadis and the whole acoustics people, and they were the sort of first people who tried to categorize before we had a computer, but it took up almost the whole of this apartment.
Mm-hmm.
It was a specially built building in the courtyard of his office.
Okay.
And you turned it on with a big clunk.
It was just like a mobile phone.
Yeah.
Light dims.
Yeah.
So anyway, they had this acoustics meeting every year, and they would go on a boat all through the Aegeus from one island to another, and they always finish on Delos. And Delos is an island beside Mykonos that is completely empty, and it has an old theatre, which is still recognizable, but it's a ruin.
Yeah.
This theatre, she was to dance at the theatre, and she brought a dancing partner with her.
You had brought a dancing partner.
Yeah.
Okay.
Beside her husband, she brought her back. And he...
Because her husband didn't know how to dance.
And he supported it. Yeah.
Sure.
Anyway, at the last minute, he got sick.
Oh.
Really badly sick. He was put into the hospital. And checked up, and then there was this final Delos
soiree.
Yeah, in the theatre. And then they made a statement every year about the world. They're really good, I mean, actually. In the 1960s, they just talk about sustainability. Good. And I had to jump in and dance. So it was just so I've had a contact with them since last time we were in California. I saw her for 20 minutes for a cup of coffee. And it's amazing. She's completely wizened, but she's still dancing.
Still dancing.
Halprin, Anna Halprin. Lawrence Halprin is the husband. He's the architect. And he actually built her a dancing platform in the forest right beside their house. And that's sort of
near Big Sur?
Yeah, on the main road down there, and it's just sort of off towards the ocean, but not on the ocean.
Sounds gross.
Just amazing. Yeah.
So Matthew came up with talking about sustainability being not enough. And it really, his points really did remind me of permaculture, where you improve systems and not only sustain them. And sustaining a system is really not enough, since we need to improve them.
Well, and since the world around you is changing, having new possibilities emerge, new combinations, new iterations, just laying there latent, doing their thing. Might not. If a system is able to support additional diversity, there's a huge advantage to it, right? So that when something new comes along, it doesn't wipe out the whole thing. It's that additional diversity is a
gets its room to flourish.
Yeah, that there's the.
Or it doesn't become a monoculture.
It doesn't become a monoculture, and well, I frame it this way, that there's two ways to get resilience, right? One is through experience. Hey, we've had forest fires. over and over and over for thousands of years. Guess what? The only trees and plants that are here are pretty good at handling forest fires. You know, they might burn down, but it's actually a part of their process for the new seed sprouting or whatever. And it's actually a tool. It can be seen as a tool that those sets of species make use of for helping them outcompete their competitors, right? The others that can't handle forest fire. This is something that they do to keep everything else sort of suppressed in a way. And so that's a way in which the things that have worked in the past, hey, we've got present, and so we're capable of handling those kinds of circumstances, those types of challenges or experiences. And so that's one form of resilience. But another form of resilience is resilience against unforeseen events, unforeseen circumstances. And to my knowledge, the only way of maintaining resilience against the unforeseen is through diversity. It's through having a bunch of stuff on the table, preferably none of it too tightly bound, so that you can have a disruption at one point and it can result in a fluctuation across the system, but it doesn't result in a catastrophic failure across the system. And it's not that this is a wonderful thing or a terrible thing. It's just sort of that's how it works. If you get to that too much of a monoculture and the world shifts, then all of a sudden, catastrophic failure. But they were speaking with me about how to make good soil yesterday, and I commented that I'm interested in permaculture, but I know very little about it when it comes to the practical. How does it all work? I'm more of a philosopher and theorist, and so I'm taking the little bits that I'm gleaning here and there and going, oh, I see that working in these other ways as well in complex systems. But how to make charcoal? Not in my wheelhouse yet.
Permaculture is think before you leap. And permaculture is design. Permaculture is point of fact not particularly has to do with plants at all. It has to do with thinking. And I see what you're saying. How do you put the plants together? And the perfect example is in some climates where you're prone to forest fires because of the plant that has taken over. Then you find other plants to dampen that. I mean, Byron Bay, talking about Byron Bay. In Byron Bay, when a hell of a lot of a particular type of eucalypt, which is taken over, mainly because they keep clearing the ground, and then that allows it to take over. And then they found that in the system that's there now, that if they do a very big sunflower, what happens is the sunflower holds the moisture, and the sunflower tips over immediately when the fire comes and puts out the fire.
Oh, interesting.
And puts it out definitely so that it doesn't go again, because there's so much moisture in the huge sunflower. So you go through places in Byron Bay where the people know of this, and you think, what are they doing? Are they selling sunflower seed? No, they're not. It's just there as
it's cheaper than hiring a fire department.
Five rank.
So you can, that's therefore it's a design situation for that situation, and particularly for that. And so that was really fun. There were two inventors of permaculture, and there was Bill Mollison, who died a couple of 6 months ago, and his student, who was actually put the idea together that we had to forget about Darwin and the survival of the fittest, is the completely wrong interpretation of what nature is. Nature is supporting each other if they're allowed to go the way they want to go. And and we have to. I mean, now that we're using the word mimicry, but up to then it was you find out the particular biosystem for your area, which can be different to 20 kilometers away, and then you mimic that, and actually the last place that I visited on a trip in Australia was with the student, the then student called David Holmgren.
Yeah.
In fact, the only way you were interested, I would have brought this book. Have you seen it on my coffee table?
His book?
This book has just arrived.
Haven't you?
Yeah. It's amazing. It's one of these square books, and it's about that high, and it's just his area, and he's applying the 12 permaculture principles and the 4 ethics to his area, and he has all the pictures in it of examples. I mean, right down to how to revamp a bicycle for his area. Yeah, and his idea is now, all his books up to now have been, most of them have been translated into different languages. And the principal books I just got translated a year and a half ago, came out Christmas 12 months in German. And it's having an amazing effect, because it's just saying, get away from talking about comfrey and mulch and things like that. Get to the points of talking about, how do we get resilience going? How do we get variety going? More, not just talking about it, but actually doing it.
Yeah.
And and it was just wonderful. I mean, he's living on 1 hectare. We have 5 out there. Yeah. Well, actually, we have 8 because we've got the 3 in the forest. And he's living in 1 hectare, and it's 2 families and 3 helpers, and they work at the most 5 hours a day, and they have everything.
Yeah.
The only thing other than not quite up on is the mobility. But they're working on that, and we're working on it here too with e-mobility. Yeah. And so and he's about 60 now, and his wife is a little bit more, and she's the one who has to do more with animals, but she is a person who's all the time observing and all the time saying what she's observing. So she's actually...
She's sense making in a translated sort of way.
So then he comes in with, well, then why don't we do that and that? Because she's... so the 2 of them are just amazing in that way. And what he's done, he says, if you really want to do a good book nowadays, you need more than yourself. So he does this right from the very go now. He says, how about getting together a group and we do a book? And I do my more theoretical part, and you do your documentary, or you do your whatever it is, And so it gets together, and this is what's come out now. It's really, really quite amazing. Yeah. And it's a means now that sort of every Tom, Dick and Harry can understand it. But it takes a while, because it is a rethinking. I mean, it's just... And in point of fact, you're almost putting everything in question. Even the fact that you would use a spade in the ground. Is this necessary? Maybe it is in that particular position, but in maybe 80% it isn't.
Sure.
I mean, the example is when you go to the toilet. None of us question the toilet. And it's about the most stupid thing that we have
We're throwing away perfectly good resources.
It was a good idea when it was invented, and when all the streets were filled with poo and everything. It was one of the easiest, fastest way to get rid of that. But it's not the topic anymore.
And it was from observing. You see, they looked out of the window and they saw the rain taking all the poo away. And if the trees had a fall and had some sort of a gradient, then you could get it to a certain position and
You could do something with it.
do something with it. And of course they did. I mean, they're still called the Riesenfelder in Berlin. There's a whole system in Berlin, and I think this is one of the reasons why it became such an important city so early. Was they managed to get the whole poo out onto you could almost say semi-moor ground, and in this ground with the poo on top of it, and the moor had very little else than sand in it, and so they had this water and sand, and so they were able to do a huge production there. But of course, the downside of it was they were all having worms and sicknesses.
Because they were producing food.
Yeah, because they didn't go through the fermenting system. They
went straight at it.
Did it linear rather than
having to go through the
I
cycle.
mean, that's what we're doing, or trying here in the different black earth, terra preta.
And the fermenting system, regardless of the mechanism in terms of how you do it, that as part of the process kills particular forms of organisms and enables others to thrive. What is it that it comes to a certain temperature? What is the
Actually, what it
what
does,
is the mechanism?
what it does is it allows more microorganisms to live. It's got away from the killing. You know, and then the thing is that's what I call the Darwin system. You know, you get a plague of a particular pest, and then you take pesticides and you kill it. You know, and then you don't think of all the different
repercussions.
And side effects.
So
in point of fact, if you have a compost heap, I explained it with the compost heap and the terra preta bed, which is no more than sitting height. And why is it that? Because when it goes over that height, it gets hot in the middle, and it kills the compost, kills half of the effective microorganisms that you want. Whereas if you can get going here, and you have to make sure that you're getting all the ones that are helping you, and they will actually sort of fiddle around until they've got their own habitat.
Stasis. Okay.
And one of the things that you can do in getting and helping them in habitat is the biochar. But it has to be biochar powder, not pieces. We all look for pieces of charcoal at this size because that's what it looks well and works well when you're grilling a bit of meat, you know. And we're so used to wanting, and everybody who's making charcoal wants to make it big. Yeah, and in point of fact, you should be getting powder. And so I have a 33-year-old human's toilet, which was composting, and now I have it's the idea that the Swedes had with the big tank, the Klimasmotrum, and I have that going now, making terra preta. So in point of fact, minute I shit or partly my pee is actually immediately going into making earth.
Making
new earth.
New earth.
Which is so solid and so strong I have to mix it 1 to 10 when I get it out. I don't get very much. So for a 2-person family, I'd get maybe 3 big buckets a year only.
Okay.
But that's enough to keep everything going because, see, the whole thing with terra preta is because the microorganisms are recreating themselves within it, and that's that was what the people in the Amazon somehow found out 500 years ago. Yeah, and that if they could keep the microorganisms going, they could keep the earth renewing, and all they had to have were the leaves falling down. And so this sort of thing, it's always the connections between the things. It's not the thing itself, and it's not when you've got bugs that you go for that bug. That is exactly the wrong thing. I mean, the good example is out here on the most heavy being out on the permaculture plant, and the first couple of years we had so many mice. It was all over the place because obviously our answer was to keep the water in the sandy soil. We put mulch on top, and we made an exact perfect biotope for mice to propagate and to become thousands and thousands of there. And we didn't have the other animals that would take care of the mice. So then we built these berms all the way along, which was also a windbreak. And in the berms there are all sorts of little places where weasels and hedgehogs and all sorts of different things like salamander and what they can live, and they take care of the tiny little mice. And so we've got less than a quarter of the mice now, just by building this, and it's built of old rubble, from old houses or from somebody who took down a tree or something like that. This is just, in point of fact, stuff that would be thrown away otherwise. And then you have to still keep getting them because that breaks down in the normal system. And then what you do is you as you said, the variety, you just don't go. See, this is where Hija and the effective microorganisms went wrong. He just took 7 microorganisms and he put it into this. He went back to Japan, he learned about it in Austria, went back to Japan, and he patented it for Japan. But he didn't realize in patenting it for Japan that it was a patent for the whole of the world. So EMs, effective microorganisms, are certain 7 microorganisms that are 9, I think, that work pretty well, but they don't work everywhere. So we've gone into it. I've been working with a microbiologist, and over the last, since 1992, and he has just connected up and tried everything out. I mean, just amazing. He's about 70 now, and he's never moved from home. He's actually working on his mother's huge garden.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, and he's doing all these experiments with microorganisms. But he's one of these people who takes notes of everything, and then goes at it in the winter time and puts all these notes together and finds new recipes and new ideas. Amazing guy. Right, but I mean that's just a sort of a thing that we already have to begin questioning our own ideas, because the ideas become recipes so very quickly, and not principles, and not design elements. And so that's the whole thing: get the design elements going. And of course, these principles can be put onto crypto currencies as well. It could be onto all sorts of things. I mean, point of fact, that's you could almost say what's behind a lot of what Margaret wrote. That she just began questioning everything and then questioning different connections and different networks and that we just take for granted.
Yeah.
Because people would sort of say to her, "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to cut out the banks?" And she'd say, "Well, maybe the banks have a couple of good things, but we have to cut out where they're going wonky."
So what is the nature of your contact with Gregory Bateson's daughter been, and what is the basis of her interest in Holo and Holochain?
Well, Nora, thank you. Nora runs something called the International Bateson Institute, based out of Stockholm, and she's a documentary filmmaker. She wrote a book. She's an author. Her most recent work is a book called Small Arcs of Larger Circles. And she focuses on the interrelationships of systems. And she's started doing this thing called, she's calling warm data labs that are really focused on the interrelationships between systems. So she was in San Francisco last week and hosted one on addiction. So we're looking at, okay, what are all of the different systems that are related to this and the various forms of addiction? And this one that we're doing in Stockholm, she's doing, and I'm just coming to participate, is going to be on essentially the future of learning or future learning. Originally we were going to do something on cryptocurrencies, but this will be on future of learning. And I'm also going to host a Holochain event at the same venue the night before, which is why I have to go catch a bus in an hour and a half. She has really, her father had really dove deeply into these patterns, and she has continued that work. She had coined a term called somathesy, which is a term she uses to describe the way in which living systems are systems of mutual learning. That it's not, she actually really takes issue with the word impact, because she feels that it almost masks what's actually the dynamic relationship that's always happening in any interaction. A friend of ours, Anne Badilla, who's a wonderful thought leader and facilitator, consultant based in Silicon Valley, connected us together last fall, and it's been sort of a joy. We've had a few conversations that we've recorded with some other folks. So we recorded one with Eric and Nora and I, and then I pulled her into another conversation with her and I and a friend who's a musician who's working on an album called You Are Me, I think is the name of this album. And he's really playing with identity. And so she's been just a joy to sort of scheme with and collaborate with.
Is she, Catherine's mother was Margaret Mead.
Yes.
And Nora's mother is somebody else.
That's correct. And I actually don't know Nora's mother's name. But I don't believe Margaret was Nora's mom. I think Nora...
That was how I met Catherine. You see, Margaret Mead was in the group around Doxiadis in Greece.
Okay.
And Margaret Mead was somewhere between 70 and 80 when I met her, and she was having trouble in walking because she was a bit too fat for herself, and she was always with this big stick. And sometimes we young men would be both sides to help her. But she would go on all the old ruins of
She still wanted to adventure about.
She wanted to see everything, and we helped her. And
Yeah, I know Nora. From the footage I've seen of Nora from when she was younger, Gregory was pretty old when she was a little girl, and
so that was after he split with Margaret Mead.
Yeah.
That was a very actually short relationship because, well, it would be very difficult to live beside Margaret Mead.
Oh yeah.
If you ever,
He might not have been so easy
if
either.
you ever met a domina, that was one,
Yeah.
She walked into a room and she took over.
Sure.
Immediately.
Sure.
Yeah, and-
She was just a force of nature. So, well, a few things. I want to ask more about these boat trips and who this crew of people was, because that sounds really fun.
Yeah, but what I wanted to say was,
Yeah.
I had a funny thing happen on Saturday evening.
Okay.
I got a phone call from Amsterdam.
I'm sorry.
From two guys who were working with Margaret
Okay.
in 1993 already.
Yeah.
And they were really young students then. And they're now, I'd say, a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And
Less young students.
yeah. And they've been working quite a lot on different currencies, especially on cryptocurrencies. And they are thinking of starting a foundation in Amsterdam to be called Margaret Kennedy Foundation. Because they felt that she was their role model and she was the person who got them thinking on these lines, etc. And
Margaret Kennedy, not Margaret Mead.
Margaret Kennedy Foundation.
Yeah.
Now,
Hence the call to you.
Huh?
Hence the call to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And
But she had studied with Margaret Mead. They had studied with Margaret Mead.
no, they had studied with Margaret Kennedy.
Okay, got it. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Too many Margarets.
I was doing Margaret.
Too many Margarets. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, one is Margaret Mead, it was Margaret, and the other one is Margaret. Yeah.
Yes.
And anyway, I thought if you were, Amsterdam is much nearer to Paris. If you're going back to Paris, it might be an idea to get to know them because they seem to have got some sort of a way that they're actually making their normal money and supporting two families on this currency consultancy that they're doing, and it's mostly in countries that speak something like Dutch or English. So they've been in Great Britain quite a lot too. Yeah, and that might be, if you still got time in Paris, it might be good to either get them to go over there. They're talking about coming here to think over this thing about the foundation.
Well, I've been invited to come to Amsterdam to come do some, probably a meetup and give a little talk about Holochain. So I'm likely going to be in Amsterdam sometime over the next month or so. So would love to connect with them. Yeah.
Okay. I have your mail, have I?
If you don't, I know someone who does.
Yeah. Okay.
We can get connected.
I think I know them too.
So let's see. There were a few things. I completely agree with the Darwin survival of the fittest being totally wrong-headed. The way that it got framed by a man named Paul Kraffel, who's been a fairly substantial influence for the folks on the Metacurrency Project and Holochain, all that. He describes the actual pattern as survival of the fit, not the fittest. Survival of the fit, the collaboration that has the and sort of to Nora's point, this is always a relationship. There's not me and environment. This is a contextual relationship where there are feedback loops, and there are sort of larger scales of feedback loops. Another group of folks who had pulled together a collaborative book project. The two editors, it was Hollings and Gunderson, maybe. One of them, I believe, was the person who introduced the term resilience to the ecology world, or in the academic side, at least. But they had pulled together a bunch of social scientists and natural scientists and ecologists, etc., to do sort of a collaborative project called Panarchy, Understanding Transformation in Human and Natural Systems. And I had sort of had my own little sets of insights earlier that year. I had taken some time out. We actually talked a fair bit about this in our interview last night. I had taken some time out to sort of really try to dive into living systems and just do some thought experiments around how does this all work? And I'd come to some conclusions, and then I went and read a book by Paul Kraftful called Seeing Nature, and this other book by these folks called Panarchy. And Seeing Nature was this wonderful collection of stories that made visible some of the patterns that I had felt like I had spotted, and Panarchy was this much more academic work, but that also made visible some of these patterns and made visible the ways in which there was nesting going on. There was sort of a fractal aspect to this, where you would have, they really focused a lot on how an ecosystem comes into some sort of coherence, how some set of organisms come into some amount of coherence, how they end up maturing, basically becoming ever increasingly efficient at drawing in the resources in the context that they're operating in, and then how that increase in efficiency and decrease in diversity ends up eventually having them get disrupted, and there being some release event, and this whole cycle kind of repeats. But they've also talked about the way in which that would be nested. So you could have, a tree that is itself a collection of patterns and organization of resources, and that tree sitting in a stand of trees, and there's other animals and things happening, and plants participating in that ecosystem, and there's just part of a larger forest. And at these different scales, you have relationships. And one of the patterns that I really enjoyed that they pointed out was the way in which release events and maturations or exploitation cycles shift back and forth between these scales. So if you have a fire on a tree touches fire, that release event might spread to the stand of trees, which might spread to the entire forest, right? So these release events can sort of spiral upward, and they called that revolt. It's kind of how they articulated that pattern. But once some release event has happened, and you've got a bunch of sort of dead matter sitting there, what comes in to exploit, and what ends up really thriving in that new
free space kind of.
Yeah, exactly. The new chaos is largely determined by the larger context that it's sitting within, right? It's largely determined by that larger space. What are the things, the seeds that had fallen in previous times? What is the rainfall that's available? How much sunlight is available? All of those factors that have to do with that larger layer of an ecosystem that moves at a slower time cycle. It takes much longer to change
Or
shape.
even has a staggered time cycle,
Yes,
which is where I see the dynamics coming into it.
that's right.
Because we're always thinking in lines.
Yeah, and so much of their point is you have these that it is staggered. That was so much of what they were focused on was yep, you'll have these release events that then lead to another shift, but that there's everything seems to be moving slowly, growing slowly, and then all of a sudden there's a boom, a sudden shift, and then things are maybe moving in a slightly different direction all of a sudden. We talked a little earlier about resilience and the various forms of resilience, and I want to sort of loop this back to something that I had thought about years ago, which was Gene, my friend who's 89 years old, he said, after a lifetime of studying all this stuff, there's two things that I believe in. And and I'll just sort of put up front, Gene's sort of a bummer. So those two things are Darwin and Malthus. And Malthus, who basically said the population will grow and grow and grow until we reach the limits of what we're capable, what the resources in the environment are capable of supporting, and then we're going to experience a whole bunch of conflict. Right? Things get real. As soon as this curve starts to go back the other way, more people equals less resources for each. Life gets harder and harder. And that's an overly simplified version, but so Darwin is survival of the fittest, or at least how he was interpreted for much of the last century or so. And so he's sort of looking at this as we're kind of screwed, like things are going to be bad. At one, flat line as carrying capacity of a system is, oh my gosh, such an oversimplification of how systems actually work. But two, what he was assuming in sort of saying this is what's going to happen with population is that the population doesn't start to sense those limits until it's too late. It's really a sensing issue. And my point to Gene was, well, one, it's not about survival of the fittest, it's about survival of the fit, right? The collaboration. But also, if you're capable of sensing or internalizing the pain that occurs up at this level, and you can actually have that pain felt by individuals far earlier. So that we see this in culture all the time. If everybody stole from everyone else, then things might not work so good. If someone tries to steal something, others begin to ostracize them and treat them as sort of an undesirable person to associate with. That actually internalizes the pain, which checks the stealing far earlier before it becomes a system-wide problem. Right? So there's a way in which pain is a really important steering mechanism for helping a community to collaborate, to organize itself at higher scales. And so many of the folks that work in the domains that we're focused on, especially in terms of social coordination, many of them frame what they're excited about in terms of abundance, creating an abundant world. And it sounds like a wonderful thing, but I think hidden within that is this assumption that we shouldn't have pain. But if you remove the ability to experience small bits of pain, you remove the ability to sense when you're steering off course. And so you make it so that you end up experiencing catastrophic failures as opposed to minor course corrections. And we talked earlier about this panarchy cycle of sort of there's a release event and there's some reorganization, there's things sort of coming in from the periphery, and then all of a sudden some set of organisms start to collaborate in a way that reshapes the landscape in ways that benefit that set of organisms. This is, of course, dependent on the presence of a landscape. If you're in the middle of the deep ocean, you don't see these sorts of patterns so much because there's no landscape for them to alter. And so you see these cycles of release, reorganization, release, reorganization. You don't see one set of organisms being able to get a toehold and use that to its advantage to sort of push others out and start to establish some upward cycle, increasing complexity along that dimension, along that sort of set of organisms. But anyway, release, reorganization, exploitation, something really coming into its own and pushing other things out, and then maturation, and then the next release event. So with that as the pattern of I've just lost my train of thought.
Can I make a point?
Yeah. Yeah. So pain stuff. Yeah.
I don't.
Let me just wrap up that part. So the one piece that becomes really obvious here is the key to avoiding big catastrophic disruptions at some larger scale is actually having lots of minor release events. So when you look at agile and lean methodologies and those kinds of things, that's exactly what it's about. It's about how do you pull in and have minor failures so that there can be different steerings at small scales without you leading to some larger catastrophic failure. That if you actually, at some level, what that means is how do you pull additional diversity into the system, so you can be running these sort of parallel experiments and figuring out, oh, this is working, this isn't working. That actually increases or decreases your likelihood of some catastrophic release event. Sorry.
Okay, cool. So, a couple of semi-related points. So first of all, what you were describing about the nested systems that the anarchy folk draw attention to is pretty much identical to the concept of holons and holarchies, with each of those different nested systems representing a different level of a holarchy. So that's just something to be aware of, because it's helpful to recognise the parallels between these different schools of thought that they themselves might not be aware of simply through not having familiarity with what else is out there. With regards to this business of it being beneficial for people to, as individuals, to sense what is going on at a collective level, I don't see how that works as a standalone thing, with that, unless it's accompanied by this broader sense of identity, self-identity, on a global scale. So, one of the things that I believe in, that I think kind of sets me a little bit apart from the Holochain sector folk, is that I do want to proselytize, in a sense, and I do want to encourage people to open their hearts and their minds to develop a broader awareness, a broader sense of self, and to see themselves as connected to the whole of nature. And I believe in concepts like brotherhood, universal brotherhood, universal sisterhood, however we want to call it, the creation of a one world family. I believe in the power and the value of these memes, and however we want to describe them, I don't really see how any of this, I think they're important, and I don't see how any of these aspirations work in isolation without this. So, for example, you're saying that if people have the ability to sense what's going on, they can feel pain earlier and take action earlier. I don't get that, because to give a very specific, concrete example, many Syrian refugees have been coming into Europe over the past couple of years, as you know, and what this has led to is some European countries, especially Germany and some of the Scandinavian countries, taking on, allowing many refugees in, to a point where it creates a pushback effect, and as a result of this, the far right, have gained popularity in Germany, and I believe probably in some of these Scandinavian countries too. Now, if I'm a Syrian refugee fleeing Syria, and I'm aware of this phenomena, at an individual level, it's only going to increase the urgency with which I try to get to a country like Germany or Denmark or Norway or Sweden, because I know that the portcullis of that castle is in the process of rising up, and I want, like on a film, I want to sort of jump over the moat, grab it, and clamber in before it's too late. So I just don't get how that can possibly work at an individual level. What I do get is how it can work at a global level, with all of us seeing what's going on globally, and recognizing how this whole thing is playing out, and I feel somewhat critical towards liberals who take pride in just simply having a pro-immigration stance without and not taking account of the perspective of indigenous populations who are harmed, in one way or another by mass immigration. So yeah, I just don't get how this works except through this embrace of universal brotherhood, universal sisterhood, one world family concept, and then us all coming together to find a collective solution to these type of issues.
Hasn't it though also, I mean, isn't the whole problem that we're not seeing it as a flow, we're seeing it as, we're seeing it as a whole lot of stop points, and that is then considered to be, we've got there. And in point of fact, we never get there. It's because, so, both of you are going on a semi-linear fashion of analysing. And in point of fact, there's something comes always behind. So in point of fact, your beautiful picture of the portcullis, well, the same thing is when the portcullises got up, it's a different situation than it was there. So while it's happening, the situation is happening, is changing all the time. And so
people are moving for the back door.
Yeah, and there isn't really that much of a feedback.
Yeah.
And so it's not quick enough that these ones coming on can take on the new situation. So it's a rethinking all the time.
The point is that to the extent to which a Syrian refugee is aware that mass immigration from Syria is leading to an increase in the popularity of the right-wing, far-right parties within Europe, which is what has happened, especially in Germany, and caused great alarm to many Germans. Especially, I think, probably more within Germany than outside of Germany even. Obviously, there's also far-right leaders in Holland, like Geert Wilders, who's gained quite a lot of power and influence. And these people, even if they don't assume positions of power, they dramatically shift the balance of power, because the other mainstream politicians shift to the right, veer to the right, in order to try and cater to their constituency, to prevent them from gaining traction. So, I mean, if I'm a Syrian refugee and I see this phenomena happening, I'm the one who's aware of the bigger picture, it's only going to increase my urgency to flee, my own personal urgency to try and get into Europe, which obviously is contributing to this effect. So it doesn't have these sensing mechanisms. Just an individual on their own being able to be aware of these trends, these larger trends, doesn't help the situation.
So there's a couple of things. Our current system of politics and the way that we do regulation does not have significant feedback loops. That's true. I'm not trying to state that pain is always good. That is not the case. Sometimes pain is crippling. But if you don't have the ability to sense, and that's all pain is an ability to sense, then you lose the ability to steer. That's not to say that a Syrian refugee experiencing pain is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, at one level, what you guys are trying to do with NewMap is to enable people to sense more of what is happening so that they can better steer. That they can better steer as individuals, that they can better steer as groups. That's what we're working on as well. I'm not afraid to use the word pain to describe part of that sensing. At one level, what that means is the ability to tell the difference, to distinguish between this feels less desirable, this feels more desirable. If I'm not able to notice when things are less desirable, painful in some way, emotionally, physically, with something else, then I have no ability to decide. That decision making is not a rational thing, that it is fueled by emotion, and that the emotion is what leads to the motion at the end of the day, right? And that capacity to experience, I'll sort of take this out of the abstract just a touch. If I buy jeans that are made with slaves, and I show up at the party and other people go, really? Slave jeans? That's painful for me. That's a way that I internalize the pain that may be happening elsewhere in the system. It's not a direct result. It's not like, that was definitely going to happen. No. It's a complex system where these other folks have made a decision for themselves that they think that's an unacceptable thing to participate in a system that we know supports slavery, and thus to become a slaver, right? And that leads to a pressure for people not to support slavery. If you live in a world where that's not easy to see because, supply chains are complex and I don't know where this comes from, well then there's no expectation to be aware of where it comes from and to be able to steer. But as soon as the information systems, like the things that Holochain are trying to enable, and New Map are trying to enable, as soon as those start to become a part of the system, they shift the expectation and thus lead to different pressures placed on individuals to steer.
But they only change the expectation if that increase in perception and the ability to sense is also accompanied by a corresponding increase in people's level of moral maturity and ability to care.
I don't think so. I think that doesn't have to change. Because right now people care about those things. They care about slavery today. They don't have to care more if the tools make it easier to act. I care about clean dishes. The possession of a dishwasher makes it more likely that I will have clean dishes. Because it reduced the difficulty of taking action in that direction. From my perspective, much of what technology ends up doing in our lives, because it reduces the amount of personal human effort required, is that it actually increases our sensitivity. Our expectations of how good is good enough shift as the effort required to get to that level decreases. Right? So if it requires almost no effort and you can have a wonderfully clean home, well, why not have a wonderfully clean home? And you come in, you go, why don't you have a wonderfully clean home? Don't you have robots to do all of this for you? But if on the other hand, there's no running water, and there's no electricity, and there's no vacuums, and the process of making a home really clean is actually quite a bit of work. We don't expect ourselves or one another to have a home that's quite as clean, because it would be so much effort. Who's going to spend all their time on that? And so this is the way in which I see those pieces. Yeah, there is another piece, but I'll hold on to it.
But you seem to be taking as a given that everyone has reached a certain level of moral maturity and ethical development, and I just don't see that. I mean, I've had conversations with people in which I've told them, for example, about the fact that Britain is currently still selling arms to Saudi Arabia, who have been conducting the most abominable war crimes against the people of Yemen over the last couple of years. I'm really completely sickening what the Saudis have been doing to the people of Yemen.
How sensitive are those individuals that you're telling this story to? How sensitive are they to that, given the complexity of their daily lives? How much other things are competing for their attention? I've got to pay these bills. My kid needs to get into this next school thing. I've got a tooth that's hurting. And you come in with something that, while very important, maybe, is distant and removed. They don't feel the pain in a personal way. This is part of why storytelling and documentary filmmaking are so powerful, because they bring the experiences that might otherwise be distant and removed into our lives in a way where we can experience that pain. You have so immersed yourself in that world and those studies that you feel that pain. You have internalized that this is terrible. But when you have a conversation on the street with somebody, it doesn't reach that level for them. And I don't think that has to, and this actually comes back to why why we land a little differently than we will all come into oneness. The price, I'm blanking on the name of the guy who said this, but the price of information is clear. It's attention. We have limited attention. We have limited ability to pay attention to different things. And so as we have more information become available to us, the thing that we lose is the ability to pay attention. If you try to have each person pay attention to everything, they drown. There's a complete overwhelm, and they become unable to prioritize and act. Ecosystems, natural living systems, do not favor organisms being able to sense the whole. They instead favor organisms being able to do really partial sense making based on their immediate context and figuring out. And they don't have to be aware of the larger feedback loops. It's just that if they happen to start doing something that undermines their own context, they go away. And the system learns, that didn't work. Right? They didn't have to have intent about it. They didn't have to have awareness about it. It just didn't regenerate. That pattern went away. And this other thing, again, with no more intent or awareness, happened to interact with its surrounding collaborators, its surrounding context, in ways that did regenerate. And these are always partial sense makings. These are, each of these organisms is only sensitive to certain things, right? There's a part of my body that probably has some bacteria, and it only eats O2 molecules or something, right? And from its perspective, the world isn't about tea, and it's about O2 molecules. That's all it pays attention, and a certain level of temperature range. It gets to something where it's kind of too warm, it goes, ooh, and then, makes a move for it. And in this way, the nesting of these systems of coordination or systems of organization enable consciousness or sensitivity and steering to happen at this level, just about these things, and at this level, just about these things, and at this level, just about these things. And those are both nested and in parallel. Right? My body has a set of these things that are happening. Your body has a similar set. I'm not inside of you. We are kind of parallel environments interacting in a larger context. I'm breathing in air and breathing out air, and sometimes you're breathing that back in. And so we have some relationships. We are definitely interacting with one another, but it's different from the nested relationship stuff. And so these are complex living systems, and the fact that at different layers, that portion is only paying attention to certain signals is really advantageous. This is, at the end of the day, about information and information processing. Information is always in form. And we experience information when we are transformed. I think we might have talked about this on the Zoom call.
It's organized. It's information.
Yeah, it's information. And I am capable of noticing only information that is capable of transforming me. So I only hear the sound wave when my eardrum goes boom, boom. And then it triggers a little electrical signal and, sound, right? If I go deaf, those sound waves may still be there, but unless they're really strong and I'm able to feel the vibration in my whole body, I don't notice them. Go.
So I think the first thing that I would say is that I don't think that I don't believe that it necessarily has to be an either or. situation. I don't believe that it necessarily has to be either the case that you are able to increase people's breadth of awareness or specificity of awareness to quite the extent that you seem to be suggesting. And the beauty of understanding holons and holarchies is that you get to and mapping information in holarchical structure, as NewMap aspires to do, is that people get to have the overview of the entire holarchy, and they also get to dive as deep into any one specific part of that holarchical structure to the greatest extent they can. But even if they're at level 9, say, in that holarchy of specificity, so quite a specific level, from time to time they're going to want to zoom out, in order to see the bigger picture, in order to see where their little contribution fits within that bigger picture. It may be that they never go beyond level 2 of any of the other levels of the holarchy, but they still have that meta picture. So I don't feel that these two things are in conflict to the extent to which you seem to be suggesting. And I feel that you folks have taken the nature analogy a little too far, and that you're elevating nature to an extent that is not necessarily desirable, and also rejecting the value of ideas and memes that expand people's ethical awareness to an exaggerated extent. And I get where that's coming from, and I think that it comes from a sound place. It comes from really basically the insight that Karl Marx helped to popularize, that history isn't created by ideas so much as let me put it so ideas don't create social structures so much as social structures create ideas. And this also relates to what you were saying about cognitive dissonance theory. So I think that's
yesterday.
That's where and Eric likes to talk about embedded embedded meaning, embodied meaning, and so on. So I see where that particular focus is coming from, but I do think that you guys have taken it to a little bit of an extreme, and I think
we've very much taken it to an extreme.
And I want to
well, I'll say,
offer an alternate perspective.
Okay. Do you want to continue?
No,
Okay.
I'm done.
These are not in conflict, would be the way I would frame it. When you have something that is capable of handling that complexity, you can choose to see it from a particular vantage point and have that be the way in which you're zooming out. You're zooming out to this level of perspective with this level of sense making, these types of signals to pay attention to. Because when you quote unquote zoom out, what you're doing is compressing the information in particular ways. You are condensing signals using specific processes. Right? There's a choice in the processes that you're making as you do that zoom out. Now, it could be that you're zooming out to see not just atoms and molecules and clumps of molecules and an organism and an ecosystem, and right? So you could be zooming out in that direction. And that would give you, what does this forest look like? But you could also zoom out in a different direction, going atoms and the rate at which those atoms are vibrating. And then moving in a completely different direction that has to do with some temperature variation map. And so what you end up getting is a synthesis of the information in the system, but just having to do with temperature and how temperature flows are operating. Giving you a very different perspective, but there wasn't one single top from which you could view the system. And that from our perspective, in an ecosystem, that is how these things are actually structured. That what is the zoom out is dependent on the perspective. It's all perspective based. And so if you want to enable the complexity of richness in order to have that system really be able to steer, you have to have parties able to do that sort of recombination. And I believe this isn't out of line with much of what you guys are trying to facilitate in terms of the user interface on these things. But if you're describing the description of a parts to wholes kind of hole-on and nested series of hole-ons thing is a particular perspective with particular attention and summaries of systems. So you can I can look at my body and go, this is my body, this is a human body, and treat the boundary of hand as different from the cup or the glass, right? The flute, the champagne flute. And I can treat this as me and this as not me. And I can use a word, this is Matthew. And it's a simplification that helps us to go, hey, can you grab Mark? Or can you grab Matthew? And somebody goes, oh, that's Matthew over there. And it's useful for collaboration because it distills down what is actually a really complex system with some gradients between the boundaries of it and the world around it. And so if I had to say, well, can you grab the guy who is, and we tried to describe all of the nuances of the flows of activity that are happening there, it would make it much more difficult to coordinate. So it's a useful shorthand tool, the naming of things. But it's just a tool. It's not what's actually happening there. It could be that we chop off this finger, and is that a part of Matthew still? Is it not? What if we put it back on, right? So the how you name and how you condense information is a judgment call, and that those processes of condensing information, those specific processes will prove useful in particular contexts. Yeah.
I think one of
in the interest of time, yes, because I've got half an hour before I need to run.
Right,
yeah.
It's half an hour we have to go. So is there anything that we want to talk about? The cooperation near future, shall we do something together? In which direction could a collaboration work? Or is there anything we might talk about? I think this might be... It's an interesting philosophical discussion we had, but yeah.
So, to be very clear, Holochain right now is focused on one layer. We're trying to build the low-level architecture to support parties doing, hey, we're playing by a set of rules. We're running an application in a peer-to-peer way by some shared set of rules, and this works for me and it works for you, so hey, let's keep playing this game. And he wants to play that game too. Great, now we're playing this game, right? And so from our perspective, that's a really important principle, what we call mutual sovereignty. That this game proving useful to me, yep, I'll continue using that pattern. But that's something that enables the kind of bottom-up experimentation and trial and error that enables these sorts of emergent sense-makings to rise up. That said, we are very narrowly focused right now on getting that pattern live. So to the extent that we are partnering with other folks, mostly what that consists of is, hey, are you interested in building something with this? Are you interested in diving into the philosophy side of this? And us trying to help support others a little bit or connect them with other people who could do that, because our bandwidth is limited. Our ability to pay attention to all of this stuff is very limited. So our ability to actually take on specific projects ourselves is almost non-existent. The Gates Foundation came to us looking to make use of Holochain related to helping solve sanitation more generally. They wanted to really upgrade solutions to sanitation, and they realized this is a complex system. Hey, we've been told that your stuff might help in orchestrating solutions to that. And we said, that's great. Let's make sure there's a consulting firm who can do that for you. Not us. We will try to help that consulting firm and get them off the ground, But they're the ones who have to take on that business because that's a ton of work. And we think it's wonderful work, but we don't have the bandwidth to do that kind of work because we're having to operate at a different layer in the stack. We're trying to make sure that this layer of just this Holochain application infrastructure thing is functional and that we can mature it and that we can bring more people into building in these ways. And so right now, this is my job. My job is running around Europe and speaking with people who are interested enough and excited enough that they can start putting in their own activity and taking these things in the direction that's interesting for them or that solves their problem. And at some level, a lot of what I'm doing is going, yes, we'd love to play with you. We personally can only play probably a little bit. Let's see if we can find the other folks who are really excited about those particular types of projects and see if there are some collaborative advantages that you guys can gain together.
I think I got it. So what I was suggesting in the first place that this connection to Moneta for me still kind of makes sense. This one project that I'm being involved in is having this lecture about cryptocurrencies, what is out there right now, and this of course is one of the things that has to be implemented in there, and that by this cooperation there might be and now to try to get these things together, that in Moneta there are a few tech geeks who are, and if we inform and inform them and can get them involved, that would be a link of what you're talking about. So since you have with the meta currency project pretty similar goals, it might make sense. So I see two ways: either again to try to get via Caspin Large to the contact, or about the group I'm right now starting with, which is Jörg and Alexandre from Luxembourg, that I inform them what it is about, and that we have a meeting of the 3-4 of us later on. And I think if we start off cooperating, and you made this lecture about the not Holochain but blockchain before, that might make sense and help there as well. So that we
I will
can
definitely
use
pass
your
on
knowledge there, bring it together, and see how we could bring the whole topic to Moneta via our lecture to Moneta and the outer world. That I can see as a maybe reasonable.
That sounds like a good place to start.
Are you still in Europe?
I'm in Europe until the end of March.
Your last name is?
Schutte, Schutte. Schutte.
How does the name come from? Is it?
When I'm in Germany, people say it's German, and when I'm in the Netherlands, they say it's Dutch. So I'm fairly certain that it's probably borderland territory. You know, we were probably robbers that were jumping back and forth across the. Prior to those particular lines being drawn, maybe. And I'm sure that the history is something like it was Schutte, and then World War I or World War II came along, and it was no longer popular to be German in America. And somebody went, Schutte, no, that guy's down the block. I'm Schutte. I don't know that guy.
I like the guy I worked with in Pittsburgh, and his name was Stephen Ratine, and everyone said, "Oh, that's French, Ratien," and it happened to be Radowski, something like this. And the guy at the immigration just wrote down Ratine. From then on, the family was known as Ratine.
Yeah, there's a lot of those stories in America. Not the best, these immigration. And your whole family's name will be different for generations.
You put Matthew's thing in there?
Oh, gosh, I don't know.
I've only Matthew Slater in there.
Slater, yeah. Matthew Schutte, Matthew.
Dot between or just?
Is this an email? Matt@holo.host.
Matt, one or two T's?
2 T's. Matt@holo.host.
I'll send you the Amsterdam thing before I get it.
Perfect. Yes.
Host is a
That's-
top-level domain.
Yeah. It is. Yes.
And I'll be in
New.
touch.
They've done all kinds of new domains
And
now.
I'll tell him about you because I'll be in touch with him today or tomorrow.
That sounds great.
I have to. And his name is Rob Van Hilton.
Van Hilton.
Yeah.
Rob?
Not Hilton, like just
Like Paris.
Yeah.
Like Paris.
What? And so yeah, I get an idea of, if you're there, you could most likely connect up with him pretty. And he's in on this QOIN coin thing.
Yeah.
And it's mainly some community currencies and consultancy that he's talking about, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it will be wonderful to have folks like them from Coin and the Moneta folks coming in, because these are people who have been thinking about currency design for a long time. And most of the folks in the cryptocurrency world don't. They don't know anything about currency design. Our founder's a little separate from that.
This is what I wrote to Jörg, that I'm working the lecture out, and said, well, maybe that's not completely true. Have you read about this and this and this and this? And so he sent me links of about 6 to 10 projects that definitely did have the design in mind.
That's right.
And that there are far more out there. I mean, there are
more
thousands of cryptocurrencies.
That's exactly right.
There are quite a few that have that in focus.
Yes.
I'd love to.
And I will say, from our perspective, we're trying to foster richer signaling systems beyond just money-like signaling, money-like currencies, right? However, folks who've been really focusing on alternative money systems, if there's a vibrant community of people doing that and starting to build those and mature those particular patterns in Holochain, sweet, right? Like, we can't do all of this work ourselves. That's the whole reason we're trying to pull in a much larger ecosystem. And we want all sorts of those patterns tried and experimented. And kind of coming back to your conversation about ethics and morality and sort of uplifting people's stuff, I am somebody who is really deeply relativistic, and I do see morality as being something that emerges in context. That things that people see as appropriate or acceptable in one context, you put them in a different context, and they go, that's not appropriate.
Sure.
War versus the shopping mall. Those are different contexts, and actions that people conceive of as acceptable are different. You attacked that person, you went and punched that man. In a war, that would be nothing if he was the enemy and he was coming into the barracks, right? So that particular situation, it's considered completely acceptable, in fact heroic maybe, to take a certain kind of action. You punch somebody in the middle of Victoria's Secret, it's going to be conceived of quite differently.
If you pee in the forest and you pee in the mall.
Yes.
So.
And when I do, no, it's good. And so that's not to say that those aren't important and useful. I think they are. But for the kind of project that we're creating, for me personally, I realized very early on, in fact, during my first, I had outlined yesterday this epiphany moment, my third epiphany in law school, the hard problem for me to wrap my head around was, is it okay if people use this kind of system for something that I don't find desirable? And I had to get comfortable with, I can't dictate that. That if you, at the architecture layer, if you try to dictate what the outcomes are, how people are going to make use of it and steer it, you get the architecture wrong.
Yeah.
And so it is important, and it's not something that we get to make decisions on. That said, I believe that because of the way in which this ends up leading different parties to sort of hold one another in tension, it can lead to the shifts that you're looking for, even without us being the ones that are stewarding. It can lead to the appropriate ones for that context and those participants. It doesn't mean it leads to a perfect world. I don't think this gives us utopia. I really don't. I think it enables self-steering far better than we currently have. But that doesn't necessarily mean we get to, oh wow, everybody's so nice. I'll make one last point, because it is for me a really core thing. I believe that this project in general, not just what we're working on, but what a lot of other people are working on as well, is really about a shift in where regulation is centered. Right now, the amount of information in the system is so overwhelming and so complex that we don't expect individuals to steer themselves well. We delegate much of that steering to larger institutions. We will set rules about how much you're able to pollute. We'll set rules about how little you can pay people. We'll set rules about how much you have to have in the way of safety and standards. And so we're delegating sense-making to a large institutional layer, because we think that by simplifying and handling complexity at that layer, we can do it. And my belief is, by building these information systems that enable people to pull the pieces together that are relevant to them, and pull the interpretive sort of remixing and processing and transformation pieces together as well, and for them to be able to go, oh, let me grab these ones.
We have to show them.
That's right. Well,
They can do it.
That they can do. Well, and they have to have the tools, right? It actually has to be. They have to have the capacity. But if you create that, and it becomes easy for somebody to go and sense what the impact, what the effect, etc., is, and it not only becomes easy for them to do that, it becomes easy for others to do that. You actually shift the regulatory burden from the institution to the individual, because and we talked about this a little earlier, the expectations about how to behave shift. And so what happens is you end up putting the individual in the center, because they, one, are able to be sensitive to the outcomes of their actions, the types of processes or systems that they are supporting, and two, they end up being sensitive to the communities that they are hoping to interact with, the people that they're looking to have relationships with, and what those people care about. As you had sort of mentioned, if those people don't care about slavery, then this person is not necessarily going to be sensitive to the fact that slaves are used. And so it is a complex system, but they end up making decisions, paying attention to both sides. What's the effect this is going to have, and what do the people that I'm looking to interact with care about? If I've got a bakery and I'm making use of flour from some company that's polluting a river, and my customers care about that, suddenly I care about that, right? And so that's the way in which I think this ends up shifting the nexus of regulation, but it puts it onto each individual, and it only is capable of doing that if it reduces the difficulty of all that sense-making. That it's through wow, it's so easy that I just hit this button and I can see this stuff. And once it's that easy, others go, well, you didn't check? You thought it was not important enough to even look to see if you were supporting slavery or polluting the river in ways that give our children cancer, or any number of things, that it's the reduction of effort that is actually the big shift. Without that having to all be a one-size-fits-all, these are the things that we're going to pay attention to. This is the one thing that we care to pay attention to.
I mean, I suppose the issue that I have is that, obviously, I think Eric is really amazing, and what he's doing is quite extraordinary, and I think that it's very legitimate to say, okay, look, this is going to be my contribution, because it's a huge contribution. But from what I'm hearing from him, what I've heard from him in my conversations with him, and what I'm now hearing from you, it just sounds to me like you guys are making a virtue of necessity. Are you familiar with that term? So I can understand that you have to take this stance in the same way that, for example, there's a platform called Nation Builder. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's just a software company that provides software for large-scale campaigning, and they declare themselves politically neutral and say whoever wants to can use our software. We're politically neutral.
Sure.
Now, that makes a lot of sense as a service provider of any description, because the moment that you hoist your ideological flag up, people become very wary of you, and they're much less like because they know you have a particular ideological agenda, and the moment you you openly declare that then you're limiting the potential take-up of your technology. And I can understand that Scepter and Holochain is in the same position. But what I don't think is, where I don't, and to that extent I accept your stance and your position, but what I don't necessarily accept is that it represents anything more than a position arrived at on pragmatic considerations rather than one.
I want to be very clear. For us, I'll frame the first thing that you had said as marketing. I don't think marketing is what's driving us. Then the second one is pragmatism. We are pragmatists, not idealists. For us, this is not about how does this get perceived and taken up. It's about how do you get the architecture right so that it's capable of handling the complexities. The complexity and the diversity of situations that will present itself. For us, we're really consciously, even in the naming of the parts of our system, we're trying to mimic DNA. We're trying to build a new medium for the coordination of social relationships, similar to how DNA was a new medium for the coordination of biological relationships. And DNA didn't dictate much, right? It didn't dictate whether this could enable a worm, an eagle, a human, a cow, a blade of grass, right? There was all sorts of different patterns possible on that medium, to be built on top of that medium. But you actually have to build something that's capable of handling that diversity of complexity if you really want to be effective in that way. And since that's the project that we've taken on, we don't get to go, in addition to designing architecture, we need to make sure that everybody thinks carbon is bad. Right? That may be an important thing. We think that's an important thing, but it's not appropriate to bake into the architecture. If we are living on a world where there's too little carbon dioxide in the environment and the plants are dying, carbon in the atmosphere is no longer bad. It's a different context, right? So these sorts of values are contextual. And since contexts will vary, it's not appropriate for us to try to dictate at this layer. Not for the task that we've taken on. That's not to say that in a particular use, it's not appropriate to make judgments about what's desirable or not desirable. In fact, that's exactly what you're supposed to do at the application layer, is make judgments about what to pay attention to. What are the things that are desirable or not desirable? But that's a higher layer of sense-making, not the architecture layer that we're working on right now. We're trying to enable that, not dictate it.
Elf 5, Bro. Elf 1 oder Elf 5?
Yeah.
From here.
Yes, I will be able to get the bus from here.
And then through Liburg to
Hannover, von to Stockholm.
It's going to be a quick trip. Hour and a half to Hanover, short 17 hours to Stockholm. No problem. I'm like, the fingers are crossed that they have electricity on the bus. So they have power strip.
You have a European adapter plug.
Yes.
They have Wi-Fi too.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And that's the reason why Senan goes in the bus all the time. He gets all his office work done.
Good.
We are almost out of battery.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts or comments before we wrap?
Well, just it'd be great to meet you all together. And
Same.
First of all, on the internet and now in person. I'm so glad.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to future conversations with all three of you.
Yeah.
And I want to learn more about poop. Practical, pragmatic information about poop. And soil.
Come and join my poop systems.
Wonderful. Yes. So what did you guys do together? Well, we talked about poop.